Until recent times, historically speaking, the world has depended on agriculture for survival. And even in modern times, outside of Western nations, still, most people of the world depend on personal agriculture to feed families. It's no real surprise then that when we open the pages of the Bible, especially in the teachings of Jesus, we find a number of agricultural lessons to teach spiritual principles. Two of these we find in Matthew chapter 13. And I would encourage you, if you have your Bibles handy, to go ahead and open them to chapter 13 of Matthew. And in this section, we're going to find two parables where Jesus talks about things in terms of agriculture. And there's going to be two very important lessons. One is that God has work for us to do in His field. He has work for us to do in sowing. But the second and equally important lesson is that God is the master gardener. That while He gives us work to do, there are things that are definitely off limits for us. And so as we look at this text today and study these two parables, I want us to understand the need that we have to be busy in the work God has given, but also the important principle of letting God do the gardening. The first parable is a familiar parable and oftentimes called the parable of the soils or the parable of the sower. And what we find here is a man who goes out and sows seed in some very unusual places. Let's just take a look as we consider this parable. In verse 1 of chapter 13, it says that same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. And the crowds gathered around Him. And He got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood on the beach. And He told them many things in parables, saying, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seed fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, and they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Now let's stop right there for a minute. If you imagine a crowd that made its living through agriculture listening to this parable, it's sounding very peculiar so far. Here is a farmer who is at best described as clumsy. He's taking his seed and he's throwing them on the path that he's walking on. He's throwing them in an area where rocks are there and everyone knows the seed isn't going to take root. He's throwing it where thorns are going to come. And so the crowd would be listening, and I imagine rather perplexed at the point Jesus was making. But then as we come to the end of the parable, it says other seed fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. So finally, after a failure rate with all of these other soils, the seed reaches the good soil and a good harvest is produced. But note, 75% of the farmer's work appears to be useless, yet Jesus does not critique the farmer. He doesn't say, and I'm going to tell you the parable of the clumsy farmer or the foolish farmer or the wasteful farmer, none of that. Because the point of this parable is that seed made it where it needed to go. And so the crowd is likely perplexed, but we know for certain that the disciples are. And so later they take Jesus aside and they say, we need you to tell us what this parable is all about. What are the things that you're trying to demonstrate to us? And so the parable then is going to be that demonstration of how they, as well as we, need to think about our work in spreading the seed in the kingdom of God. So let's take a look down at the explanation that he gives. Going down to verse 18, he says, hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, and indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. As we look at this parable and Jesus' explanation, he explains to us that the seed is sown everywhere, even in the most unlikely of places. So whereas the farmer is sowing on the path leading to the field and the thorny ground and the stony ground, the one who is spreading the word of God is the one who's sowing in all of these very unusual and unlikely places. And so as we consider that, we need to understand that this is good work that we're doing in sowing the seed. As we think about spreading the gospel, this is something that God desires for us, because what we find out in Jesus' explanation is that the seed is representing the word of the kingdom. But let's take that a step further. Because if it's the word of the kingdom, that means the good news is a message from the king himself. This was not a work exclusively for the apostles. This was not a work exclusively for first century Christians. This is a work for any who are concerned about others and desiring to bring them into the kingdom of God. And thus we find the word being spread. So, the good work is what we need to be carrying out. And so doing good then means taking this message to everyone. Taking this message to everyone, even in the most unlikely of places. Consider the people who you know who need this message from the King. It may very well be your atheist neighbor. It may be your New Age hairdresser. It may be your neighbor who is spiritual but not religious. Or it may be a rebellious family member. For most all of us, there are all kinds of soil surrounding us. For all of us, there are opportunities to spread the kingdom in the most unlikely of places. And so as Jesus gives this parable, what He's telling His apostles, what He's telling the first century crowd that listened, and what He's telling us is that you do not need to discriminate in where these seeds are going. You need to take them, and like this farmer who appeared so clumsy in the way that he was sowing, Jesus says, that's how I want you to spread the good news of the King. This is a good work. But let's think about that from another standpoint also. Because it's a good work, we need to make sure that we are not growing weary in doing it. That as we think about spreading the message of the King, that we are not getting to a point where we grow discouraged, where we grow weary in spreading these seeds. So what would cause that to happen? One thing, and perhaps the main thing, is that when you are sowing seed everywhere, most of those efforts will produce no fruit. Now again, the idea of the parable is you are spreading it so far and wide that at some point the odds are you're going to get the seed into good soil. Yet, as we look at that parable, for the farmer, 75% of his efforts were in vain. And when we think about spreading the message of the King, the odds may be even worse than that. It may be that we're talking to people and inviting people to Bible studies and wanting them to come to church with us, yet we're getting rejected time and time again from all of these different ones, and that can lead to a great deal of discouragement. So what do we do in cases like that? Well, we understand this is not a testimony of our work. It's not a testimony that our work is in vain. In fact, I think the Apostle Paul well explains this. Again, using agricultural terms, he says to the Corinthians, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. Here's our place in the garden of God. God has said, I want you to take the seed and I want you to broadcast those seed wherever, whenever you can. Spread the message of the good news. But what Paul is saying is, don't think that you're the one who's going to cause the seed to grow. That is the work of the gardener. The master gardener, God Himself, is responsible for that. And He says to us, you have your job. Plant the seed, water the seed, and you are going to be recompensed accordingly for that. But don't be concerned if the seed is not growing. That's between the seed and God. So if we want to measure success rate in all of this, it's in the amount of time we're spending in spreading the seed. It's not that we can look back in the past year and say, well, as a result of my sowing, there were 15 people converted. That may be a wonderful thing, but it may be you look back on the year and you say, as a result of my sowing, 0 people were converted. That's in no way a testimony on the one who's spreading the seed. That's a testimony on the one who has taken the seed into his or her heart and let it die and wither there. So then, as we think about this very good work, let's make sure that we are not growing weary because we're looking to define success in the very wrong terms. That's the parable of the sower. It's interesting that Matthew immediately follows this with another parable of Jesus. And that's the parable, and it's going to depend on your translation. Some will say the parable of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds, or sometimes just the parable of the weeds. And what we're going to find is that there are similarities between the two parables, but yet there are also some very distinct differences. For one thing, we're going to find in comparison that the parable of the soils and the parable of the wheat and weeds all deal with sowing seed. Yet, in the second parable, there is a distinct difference. There are 2 sowers. Let's take a look at it. Go with me down to verse 25. After introducing the parable and comparing again the sowing of good seed, he says, while his men were sleeping, his enemies came in and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came to him and said, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, An enemy has done this. So the servant said to him, Then what do you want us to do? To go and gather them? And he said, No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now, in a very similar fashion, later on down in the chapter, just as we found with the parable of the sower, we find the parable here of the weeds being described. And Jesus says, okay, I told you there were 2 people sowing. One is the Son of Man and one is the devil. The one sowing the good seed is the Son of Man. The one sowing the weeds or the tares is the devil. But what's very interesting is where in the first parable, we find that the ground is only considered good when it produces the harvest. In this parable, the same soil is producing both wheat and weeds. And so here is the problem. You've got a very good wheat harvest, yet in the midst of this wheat harvest, you also have all of these weeds that are coming up. And so as we think about this parable, the question that comes to mind is, what is the main point? What is it that Jesus is trying to get across to us here? Well, you may find different opinions on this, but one of the main things that we'll find is that judgment will come. In fact, as Jesus is explaining what this parable means, in the harvest time, he says, the Son of Man will send his angels, they're the reapers, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun and in the kingdom of the Father. He who has ears, let him hear. This is an important point. Jesus is saying the harvest is the end of the age. The field is the world. The reapers are my angels who will come into the kingdom, and anyone who is not following the Son, the weeds or the tares, is going to be taken out and thrown into the fiery furnace. Just like in the first century, when the harvest time would come, the weeds would be gathered up and bundled and would be used somewhat as kindling for fire. That's the implication here, yet so much more serious is that we're dealing with humans here. And so we look at this and we say, okay, that's an important point. But is that the only important point? I would suggest to you that we consider something else that's said as a main point, or perhaps even the main point of the parable. And that being when the servants come to Jesus, or come to the sower, and they say, okay, you want us to go in and pull up those weeds? And the sower says, no, don't do that, because in so doing, you may root up the wheat also. What's the point then? The point that he's making here is that when you're gathering and you think you're doing a very good work in trying to rid the soil of the weeds, you may also do a very dangerous thing in rooting up the wheat. And so Jesus warns here, I don't want you damaging what's good in your zeal to get rid of what's bad. Now, before we move on with this point, we need to, at this time, very much make a disclaimer with this parable. This is not a condemnation of all judgment. So many times this parable is used to justify never accusing, never pointing out wrong. That is not the case. And in fact, that idea makes no sense when you look at, on either side of this parable, that there are commands about judging. In Matthew 7, though it starts out, judge not that you be not judged, we find a little bit later on that Jesus says, don't throw the pearls before swine. Don't give what's good to the dogs. And obviously, there is a judgment that's being made there. In the other direction, in chapter 18, if a brother does something against you, well, that's judgment. You have determined that he has sinned. He's done something wrong against you. And so you go to him, and if he won't listen, you take two with you, and if he won't listen, you bring it to the church. So it's obvious that that is not the case, that this parable is not condemning all judgment. So what then is the point? The point is, the danger arises when we try to take the judgment seat of God. There are times when God says, you can judge by what you hear someone say. You can judge by what you see someone do, because you're taking that and you're putting it alongside my word and you're seeing if it's correct. And so God has all kinds of safety measures in there. Go to your brother alone. Make sure you understood. Make sure there's not this misunderstanding. And then take two and take more. God puts the safety net in there so that we don't make wrong judgments. But nonetheless, He doesn't forbid all judgments, but He does say, you better be very careful in this, that you don't try to take my place. That you don't begin trying to condemn people to their eternal fate. That you think you're making that decision and you can go in and you can become God in these ideas of judgment. That's the danger. And so what God says, while I want you to be liberal in your sowing, I want you to be extremely cautious when it comes to judging. So let's explore that for a few minutes. When we think about the dangers of rooting up the wheat with the weeds, how can we do that? How can we fall prey to this idea of trying to take the judgment seat of God? Well, I'm not going to give an exhaustive list, but let me give you some things just to help you to begin thinking along these terms. One of the dangers of rooting up wheat is when I show a lack of patience with others. There are times when slow-growing wheat may look a little bit like weeds. And that's because not everyone is going to spiritually mature at the same rate as everyone else. For almost all of my adult life, I have been involved in teaching school-age children. And I have taught children in 7th grade. I've taught children in 12th grade. And in those years of teaching, I have seen this principle very much in place just with maturity in general. Over the years, I have had 7th and 8th graders who were extremely mature, solid, well-reasoned, thought things through, did their work. Conversely, I've had seniors who at times appeared that maybe they had not even reached the maturity of a 5th grader. Their language, their actions, their attitudes. And yet, over the years, as I've seen that latter group grow into adulthood, I've seen them become college professors. I've seen them become doctors. I've seen them become gospel preachers. Well, what's the point? The point is, you don't have a standard for every school-age child that says this is exactly where you're going to be at age 15, 16, 18. Sometimes maturity is going to take a slower rate or a quicker rate in others. Can we not make the same point about spiritual maturity? That when we look at Christians in general, there are going to be those who are extremely solid very early in their spiritual lives. And there are going to be others that it may take a while to get there. So then, we exercise patience. And in fact, we can say it even more strongly, that patience is absolutely essential. Listen to what the Apostle Paul says. As he's writing to the Ephesians, he says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another. Part of the worthiness of my call is the exercising of patience with other people. Therefore, I need to understand that when I am dealing with other people, that I am not seeking to mistake slow-growing wheat for the weeds. And so the sower is speaking to me. He's saying, you better not go out and start pulling up those weeds, and in the process, you're messing up the roots of the wheat. I've got to be patient. And in a point very similar to that, if I'm going to exercise caution to make sure that I'm not rooting up the wheat, I also make sure that I'm not showing a lack of compassion. Whereas there are different rates of maturity, I think we could also say there are times when life situations can very strongly impact one's spirituality. There are times in life where things are going to happen that are going to impact others more than they impact their fellow Christians. And I need to be aware of that. And I need to make sure that when I'm dealing with other Christians, that I am showing as much compassion as I possibly can, because God desires, in fact, we could take it even stronger than that, we could say God demands that we show sympathy to those who are struggling in these life situations. Let's again listen to what the Apostle Paul has to say. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12, he says, put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. God says, what I want you to do as you are spiritually maturing, it's kind of like when you're getting dressed and He's saying, put on your spiritual garments. He's saying, I want you to put on all of these different things so that you have this compassionate heart, so that you are going to look at your brother and sympathize with him and help him in the struggle that he's going through. So then, as we think about all of these things, we need to exercise extreme caution in how we deal with others. When I'm viewing a fellow Christian, and I don't think this Christian needs to be struggling with the point that he's struggling with or she's struggling with, many times I'm very tempted to say, well, you just need to get over it. And I will tell you, there are times when we do need to get over it. But having someone say that to us in an uncompassionate manner may very well exacerbate the problem. If I'm looking at this brother or sister and minimizing the challenge that this person is undergoing, and I just callously say, look, you got to get over it, you got to move on, I'm not exercising a great deal of compassion with that individual. So then, instead, what I do is seek to imitate Jesus Christ. You remember what was spoken of Jesus? A bruised reed He will not break, and a smoldering wick He will not quench until He brings justice to victory. That's not showing Jesus as weak. That's showing Jesus as compassionate. He's taking the very things that look like they're at the end, this bruised reed that's broken, or this wick where the fire is just about to go out, and in His gentleness, He's working to bring about restoration. That's the model that you and I need to follow. Now, are there times when our patience and compassion should come to an end? Before answering that question, perhaps the better question would be, when do I want God's patience and compassion to end with me? And the same answer for that will likely be the answer to our first question. When does my patience, when does my compassion come to an end? When do I decide it's time to cut all of that off? Well, about the same time that I want God to end that patience and compassion with me. Therefore, Jesus says, don't root up the wheat. The wheat may be struggling. Don't make it worse. Let me add one more to this list, and that would be the lack of tolerance. That's a loaded word in the 21st century, and its misuse has turned many against the idea. In fact, many sermons and Bible teachings you'll hear will make tolerance sound like a very bad word. Well, the reason for that is the fact that it has been used to accept what is obviously against God's will. But the misuse of the term does not negate the fact that we are to be a tolerant people with one another. Let me illustrate what I mean by that in this way. There is a great danger in refusing to consider another person's point of view. There are times when we are very, very tempted simply to close our ears, and maybe even worse than that when we hear someone give an alternate view of what we believe, to immediately classify that person as a false teacher or unlearned or a troublemaker or something of that nature. And over the years, there have been many churches that have stagnated because of that. Because in their traditional view of things, they come up with what they believe is the correct answer to all life situations. And when an alternate point of view is given, the church immediately shuts that down. In other words, there is no room given for discussion. That's a very dangerous thing. And what can happen is you can have a church that may or may not have the right answer to a question, but yet in believing that's the case, they view themselves as a strong church and refuse to hear anything else. that is a lack of tolerance. And that very much can harm a growing Christian. But now let me balance this out. Consideration does not mean acceptance of false beliefs. The idea of tolerance does not mean that we open up the pulpit or we open up our classrooms or we open up our personal beliefs and say, I'm going to accept anything anybody says is true. That's not it at all. That's against the Bible. But what tolerance does say is, I might be wrong. And what I am willing to do is to continually examine my beliefs in light of what someone else says to make sure that I am right on that. And if I am wrong, I'm willing to accept where I was wrong. When that is an attitude that permeates a church, that church is going to grow. When that's an attitude that permeates my life, I'm not going to become stagnant and refusing to listen to someone else and immediately labeling someone as a false teacher who disagrees with me. No, there may be times when I hear something where in the spirit of gentleness I must rebuke. And there may be times when publicly we must say that this teaching is being taught and it's wrong, but we never ever come to the point where we shut down all discussions for fear that someone may disagree with us. That's a difficult idea, but nonetheless so important if we're going to take care of the wheat. When then we consider patience and compassion and tolerance, these are ways that we are helping the crop to grow, and we're not trying to take it upon ourselves to pull up the weeds and in the process destroy the good. But before we close our thoughts, let me take it to one other point. There is also the danger to myself when I become a weed puller. And the danger to myself is how we introduce this point. It's seeking to take God's place of judgment. And I begin to view myself as the authority on determining who's wheat and who's weeds. And I begin to take my self-appointed authority and I begin to do the sorting before the day of harvest. While that's a danger to others, it most definitely is a danger to me, and it may cause me to go from wheat to weed status. So then, I need to exercise great caution. Because often, when I put myself in charge of pulling up the weeds, I'm neglecting my own personal cultivation. I am so busy looking for what's wrong in the lives of other people. I am lacking in my willingness to look inwardly and decide if there are things that I need to fix. In fact, if taken to the extreme, I allow my strength to be viewed in contrast to someone else's weakness, and therefore the more weakness that I can find in others, the stronger I feel. That is highly dangerous both here and eternally. Because what that does is it turns our faith into what I'm against rather than what I'm for. In Christianity, are there things that we are against? Absolutely. Absolutely there are. We find all manner of things where God is saying, you don't do this and you stay away from this. But the heart of my spirituality, if it is only centered on those things I'm against, I never see that I am for Jesus Christ, for His gentleness, for His meekness, for His compassion, for His tolerance, for His willingness to help others. So then, if I am trying to be the weed puller, taking God's place, I may very well find my own attitudes quickly going downhill. And this will in turn lead exactly to the danger that Jesus warned about in that passage that is so often quoted about judging. As Jesus says, judge not that you be not judged, He continues on and He says one of the dangers you're going to find is that you're using the wrong standard. And in the same sermon, he uses the illustration that what you're going to do is you're going to go around with a plank in your own eye trying to pull the speck out of your brother's eye. Well, does the speck need to be removed? It absolutely does. Jesus says that. But he says the first thing you got to do is get your own life right, to get your own house in order. And if my faith is nothing more than going around trying to find these specks in other people's eyes, I have got the plank in my own, and I am in danger of going from the wheat harvest to the weed harvest. So I need to exercise very great caution. Judgment is absolutely necessary when it comes to my relationship with others. If I hear a brother teaching something that's false, I need to correct that. If I see a sister engaged in activities that are corrupt, I need to help her with that. But the point of this parable is that the judgment that you use is always by the standard God gives. It is not putting oneself in the place of God. And that brings us back to the premise of this lesson. And that is, let God do the gardening. God is going to cause the seed to grow. And ultimately, God is going to be the judge. I do the work as a laborer that He's given to me to do. But I never allow myself to try to crowd Him in His position as the master gardener. And I hope as you and I consider these things, we understand that sometimes it's hard to make the right decision. But what we are doing is always looking to God's standard to determine how we proceed in our dealings with others. Thank you so much for joining us for this study today. I hope it's been helpful to you. And as always, let me assure you that if I can be of any service to you spiritually, I am available. If you are ready to become a Christian, let me know. If you'd like to study more about becoming a Christian, let me know as well. Let's make sure that in that day of harvest that we are the wheat, gathered into the barn to be there forever with our Lord. Again, thank you for joining us for this study.